So afterwards. So go ahead and open up Grasshopper. So you can close this, click on that. Okay, so click on that green icon to open up Grasshopper. So once you launch Grasshopper, again, this will be a tutorial that covers where to find everything in Grasshopper, kind of the basics. Again, the first thing to do when you open it up, go to View, make sure Obscure Components is blue. So that'll let you see everything. When you're starting out in Grasshopper, it's good to be able to see all the components so you know what's there. It's tab-based, so on the left are parameters, which include geometry that you can pull in from Rhino. So curves, surfaces, B-reps, geometry, which is kind of a catch-all for any of that type of curves, surfaces, etc., mesh, points. So these components here, and again, this is under params, geometry, these are things that you're going to pull in from Rhino. So when you want to pull in a curve, pull in a point, this is where to go to drop one of these components in. So I click on it, I click on the canvas, and now I can assign something in Rhino to this component in Grasshopper. Okay, so if I have a polyline that I draw in Rhino or any other curve, I can select it in Rhino. I can right click on this and say set one curve, and you'll see it turns from orange to white, and when I click on it, it's green, and so is my object in Rhino. So that's a way of associating something. So I can do that for a surface as well. So if I pull in surface, notice how I can't assign this curve to the surface. If I say set one surface, it won't even let me select that. So it's looking for a surface. So I'm going to type plane in Rhino, select it, right click, set one surface, and now it's associated with this component in Grasshopper. All right. So again, if I want to select a B-rep, I can take a 3D object, I'll make a pyramid. I can select that, right click, set one B-rep, and now that's associated. And so as I select each one, it turns green in my viewport and in my canvas. This is called the canvas in Grasshopper. Yeah, question? A B-rep is a poly surface. Yeah. So some objects here, and again, these are different ways to bring in geometry. We've talked briefly about sliders. Sliders are a way to parametrically change value. So we can manually push and pull this slider and get it to output a different number. A panel is a way to input any information. So panel, and again, if you go to input, panel, you can click on that and then click on the canvas and drop it in. The other way to get there is to double click on the canvas and type panel and find it here and click. The other way to get there is to hold shift quotation mark and you'll see panel. What we can do with a panel is we can put anything in here. We can give it a number. So let's say 3. So if you double click on it, you can give it the value of 3. You can also double click on your slider where it says slider. If you double click on the text itself, you can set that to have a minimum and maximum. Let's say we want our maximum. If we double click on that, we can say our maximum is going to be 30. And our minimum, if we double click on that, is going to be -10. And these are floating point numbers with 3 digits. We can set them to integers, in which case it's just going to say, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3 without, 0.42. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to set these to be integer numbers. You can set it to even, odd. We're just going to leave this at integers. Set the, they can't play with the digits because it's just a whole number. And we're going to set the minimum to -10, max to 30, and hit OK. All right, so I can play with, now notice this number slider goes from -10 all the way up to 30. So you can control the slider that way. And again, I went to input, grab number slider. You can also double click on the canvas and just start typing a number. So let's say I want that similar range. If I just start, just type 25, then click, it'll give me a value from 0 to 100, and it'll include that number of 25 that I included. If I double click and say 25.56, it'll give me a slider with 2 digits in my 2 decimal places there. So different ways to bring in a number slider. If you want to just input a number, there's that. There's also a Boolean toggle. So this is a yes, no. So true, false. So there's some components that need to be turned on. So maybe you don't want part of that script to be constantly running. You can set it to false to kind of turn it off, or true to be on. It reads the same way a computer reads true, false, in zeros and ones. Grasshopper also starts counting. So any list, it starts counting at 0. So if it shows you 0 through 10, there's actually going to be 11 numbers in that, right? Because it's including 0. So just keep that in mind when you're working. I'm not going to go into everything here. I think just the basics of what we need to get started. There's also various math equations you can include, operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. You can do mass addition if you have a series of numbers that you want to add together. You can create these kind of gates where it's anything larger than this will give it a true. So for example, if you're creating a facade and you want to select all of the apertures in that facade that are over a certain area, you can say anything over this size is going to get scaled up versus everything that isn't is going to be left alone. So you can set your own logic. You can set your own operations here. You can even input Python script, Visual Basic script, C#. So there's a lot of scripting language. You can create your own expressions here. So a lot of things you can input. There's also domains. You can construct kind of a range of numbers. Sets. So how do we deal with data in Grasshopper is important. So we have a list of items. We can partition the list. We can reverse that list. We can dispatch. So we can take a list of numbers and say I want it to output everything that's an even number into this component, everything that's odd into this. So you'll see as you're working in Grasshopper, these things will start to gain reason for existing. You'll start finding reasons to include these things. If you want to come up with pseudo-random numbers, you can use one of these. There's this kind of random component. It'll output random numbers, and there's no such thing as truly random in the computer world as we know it now. So they're pseudo-random, meaning it's you have a domain of kind of the boundary from 0 to 1. So it's going to give me an output from 0 to 1. there's a number of random values that I want it to output. And you're noticing I'm putting my cursor over the inputs to tell me what it's looking for. And I put my cursor over the output to tell me what it's going to give me. Okay, so let's say I want it to give me a random number between 0 and 10. Okay, so I can say, so see first, what is it looking for? It's looking for a range. Right now, the default is set from 0 to 1. I want that range to be from 0 to 10. So I'm going to go back to this math component, math tab, and I'm going to say construct domain. So you can also get there by double clicking and typing domain. All right. Finding construct domain, clicking on that. That's another way to get there. So I went to math domain, construct domain. So I can now plug that domain, and you'll mouse over it and see that symbol. You'll recognize that it's the same symbol here, so these are compatible. So I'm going to construct a domain, and by default, this is set from 0 to 1. I want this to be set from 0 to 10. So there's a few ways that I can give this component the number 10. I can double-click on this and type 10, plug that in, and if I mouse over this, now it says one value, one locally defined value from 0 to 10. The other way I can input a number into this is I can right-click it and say set one number and give it that value of 10. So it's still giving me this domain. And so now this is satisfied. And number of random values, 1, good. And the seed for the random engine. So depending on the seed number you give it, it'll give you a different random number. So let's set this to 0 just to show an example. And I'm going to do another panel here, shift quotes. And so we're seeing this number value that it's generating. So right now it's set to 7 point whatever. As I change this seed number, it's giving me other kind of random values. Okay, so this is a simple example of how to create random numbers, but you can see how many digits this has. We can set this to just be integers in a few ways. I believe if I set this to integer here, it'll just kind of remove the decimal places, right? So now this is just giving me integer values from each of these. And again, this 50 is a seed. So, it's based on that, it's giving me a different random value. So if I want another random value, I can set it to 51 or 52, right? So it's going to change this output based on the inputs here, okay? So you can see what it's outputting. And if I want to use this 5 in the rest of my component, I can pull this out and use it somewhere else. Okay, so for example, if I wanted to create, let's say, a grid of boxes, and I want their height to be different every time. Let's say I have 10 boxes, and I want to use this random seed generator to create 10 random extruded boxes, all at different heights. What I would do is I'm going to say, well, instead of just outputting one random value, I want to give this 10. So I'm going to double click and type 10. That's the way I most commonly pull in values. And you'll see that now we have a list of data. So instead of just being one value, we now have 10. And this is the kind of number on the left, and these are the random values on the right. So again, Grasshopper starts counting at 0, and it's outputting 10 values here from 0 to 9. Question? This is called a panel. So you can double click and type panel, click, or you can double click and type shift quotes, and it'll come up. So you can double click, type shift quotes 3, enter, and it'll give you a panel with the value 3. You can also put text and other things in here. So for example, you can say shift quote test, enter. It'll give you a panel with the word test in it. Okay, so there's different things we can use a panel for, but it's kind of just a blank slate for you to input things. So we gave it an integer. We now have 10 of these being generated. And notice as I play with this number slider, we have fewer. So now we have 3 all the way up to 10. Let's say we want more than 10. We can double click on this, give it a maximum of 20, etc. So we have 10 values that we can increase the number of those random values. So I'm going to keep it at 10. What I want to do is create a series of boxes. So I'm going to, in Grasshopper, we'll create those boxes. So I'm going to type box, and there's different ways of creating a box. And if you want to go to, we'll open this up a little more, we'll go to primitive. So under surface, primitive, you'll see all the different ways we can create a box. We can start with a rectangle and then just give it a height. We can start with a center point and give it an X, Y, and Z value for its various heights or various sizes in each dimension. We can create a domain box, so base plane and different sizes. So why don't we do that? We'll start with a box with different domains for each value. So we dropped in box, and again, you can double click on the canvas and type box and pull this domain box in. All right, so what I want to do is have a series of boxes. I don't want them all to be in the same place. So what I'm going to do is create a series of points in, let's say, this X direction. So I want one of my points to be here, 1 point here, 1 point here, and each point is going to be the center of a new box that's created. All right, so I'm going to start with a point in the center. So to do that, I'm going to double click, type point. Actually, I'm going to do construct point. So I'm going to double click, type construct point. And this is the one I'm going to use. So this creates a point at this location. Every point has an X, Y, and Z value. So you can see it, it's showing up at the origin. You're also seeing the box that's being generated just by default. It's defaulting to, an X range, a Y range, a Z range. Okay, so I'm starting with this point at the origin, but I want to move this in the X direction. What would I use in Grasshopper to do that? We would use the move component. So I'm going to double click, type move. Move, if I mouse over the inputs, it's asking for a base geometry. And again, geometry is a catch-all. It could be a point, a line, a curve, a surface, brep. So it's asking for the geometry to move, which is going to be my point. I want to move this point. By default, you're noticing that it's moving it up. I want to move it in the X direction. So if I mouse over this vector, it's moving it actually in the Z. I want to move this in the X. So I can double click, hit X. You're going to use this unit X component, plug that in. And we're going to give it a value. So I can just double click and type 10. So now I'm moving that point, and again, it's green when it's selected. So the moved point is here. The original point is still at my origin. but I'm moving it over 10 units to the right. And Grasshopper uses whatever units your Rhino file is set in. So if my units are in inches, it's going to move it 10 inches. If it's in feet, it'll move it 10 feet. Millimeters, same thing. So I'm moving it 10 Rhino units, which is in this case, what is it? If I type units, I'm in feet. So it's moving it over 10 feet. But I don't want to just input one number, right? I want a range. I want 10 points. And I want each one to move an additional 10 feet over. So for that, I want to give it a range or a series of numbers. I want to tell it, move that point 10 feet, then 20 feet, then 30 feet, 40, and 50, right? For 10 values. Okay, so instead of just telling it one number to move over, I'm going to give it a series of numbers. So to do that, you saw how we did a domain here. We can construct a domain. What I want to use, if I go back under sets, is sequence. So under sequence, you'll see series. So a series is one of the easier ways to do this. A series is going to ask for the first number in the series. It's going to ask for the step size of each successive number. So in our case, increments of 10. And it's going to ask for the number of values in that series. So it'll ask for, we'll keep it at 10. So by default, this is set to 0. So it'll start counting at 0. Step size is 1. What do we want to set that to? 10. So we'll double click, type 10. And now if I put my mouse over this, you'll see it's giving us values 0, 10, 20. But notice it's starting at 0. I guess we can leave it. Yeah, I guess that's good because we want there to be a box at the origin as well. So again, if I want to see that data, I can double click, type panel, bring that out, and you'll see that these are the values that are listed in that panel. So this is a good way to kind of show what's being output. I can see the values now, and I could plug this into my X. Okay, so it's taking all of these values, moving this origin point over 10 times. With the first value at 0, then it's going to 10, 20, etc. All right, so I'm moving that point 10 times. And now if I put a panel here, it'll tell me what I'm outputting. You'll see that there are 10 points that are being output here. So I can either plug this in to my box, which again, a box is asking for a base plane, which by default is defaulting to the world XY plane, right? This kind of C plane that you see here, that's the XY. I can also give it ZY. I can also give it, ZX, but I'm going to leave it at XY. But a plane also needs points, right? It needs an origin point. So I'm going to set this to here, right? So now I'm inputting the series of origin points into my base plane. And I also could have just done this. It's the same thing. It's just this panel allows me to see the data. So I'm going to do that. Plug that in. And you'll see that now there's a series of boxes that are being created. And I want to input their height, width, and length. So it's asking for the X domain, which is the kind of width in this direction. And that's going to be a series. Actually, this will be a domain. So if I mouse over it, the default is set from -2 to 2. The Y is set from -0.5 to 0.5. Z is set to 0 to 0.25. Just an example of different, dimensions that we can be inputting here. So what I'm going to do is input 3 domains. So when you construct a domain, you're giving it 2 values, a starting point and an end point. So I'm going to do the same thing over here. Double click, type domain, and I'm going to use this component construct domain, plug that in, and I'm going to Control-C, Control-V, copy and paste this 3 times. So I'm going to give each of these a value here. One nice thing, let's say these are messy and you want to organize them, you can select them, click this align, and you can equally distribute them. So it'll help you organize your Grasshopper scripts. So just to recap, and I'm going to remove these panels because they're not necessary. They're just helpful for us to see what data is being collected. So to recap, we have a point at the origin. We have that point getting moved 10 times, including 0, where it's staying at the origin. Moving it 10 times based on this series of numbers, 10, 20, 30, 40, etc. Moving in the X direction. And we're creating a box at every point. Now, I want to be able to give numbers to this box and, different domains. So right now it's set, the default is 0 to 1. I want this to be from 0 to 12. So I double click, type the number 12. It'll give me a slider. I can plug that into the max here, and we can pull this down. I'm going to give myself some more space here. I can select this, Control-C, Control-V, plug that into the B, which is, again, the kind of maximum value of that. So this is set to 20. So now I have boxes that are 8 by 20. And again, I'm plugging it into B because that's the upper value of this domain. The starting value is 0. So what it's doing is it's saying from 0 to 8, from 0 to 20, and all of those are being input into my box. I'm going to select this slider, Control-C, Control-V, and I could then control the height of the box. But let's say we don't want to control all of these with the same value. Let's say we want to use this random seed generator that we had created back here. We want to plug those into the height. So they have a consistent length, a consistent width, but they're going to have a random or pseudo-random height. So what I can do is I can take these random numbers, and I have 10 of them. I can plug those in to my B of this, and now it's giving me a random set of heights for these boxes, or pseudo-random. And I say pseudo-random just because there is no truly random number, because these are actual coming from seeds. So as I change the seed value, all of these random numbers shift around. But you'll notice I'm getting some that are too small. Let's say I'm doing this and I want to create, some kind of architectural feature, but I don't want it to be 0 or 1. I can set the bottom of that domain, instead of being 0, let's say we set it to 5, right? That's going to be the minimum size. So now it's creating 10 random points, but starting at 5. Okay, so now, again, I've plugged, I'm going to delete that. I have my kind of random code. And to make my life easy, I'm going to group all of these. So I can select them, middle mouse click, and click on this group. It looks like a green amoeba. So now all of these components are grouped together. What's nice about that is I can move them all at the same time. I can also right click on it and give it a name. So I'm going to say random generator. So this is a random generator that, again, I can easily, if I needed to copy and paste, Control C, Control V, and I can use this somewhere else. But it's a nice way of, when you're creating a Grasshopper script, if you label each section of your script, you'll be able to much more easily navigate it, open it up later. So I like to label all these components. So I'm going to label this part of it. Again, I select all these components, middle mouse click, click group, and I'm going to right click and say, so this was my point array. So I have these points, and let's say I want to hide these components. I don't want them to show up. I don't want to see this point in Rhino. I can select all of these, right click, preview off. So now those are off. And all I'm seeing now is this box. So we can play with the heights and sizes of these things. I'm going to play with that dimension, this dimension. And we can plug in this random generator to not just give us random heights. We can also plug it in to random lengths. Right? So let's say I want to undo that. I've plugged this random into my Y value. If I want to disconnect, I can hold Control, click and drag, and disconnect that component. You'll see that with nothing, it's just going to default to 1. So I'm going to plug back in my 12, and we'll see the random heights here. And again, this is giving us 10 values, random, in this domain from 5 to 10. But I'm going to double click and type 20 because I want to give it higher values. So now it's going from 5 to 20 in those random seeds that it's generating. And again, if I want another iteration of random numbers, I can keep playing with the seed value. It's going to give me random heights based on this range. And again, maybe by playing with the bottom, kind of the lower end of my domain, I can change the kind of the minimum height. All right, so we have a series of boxes, all with random heights. And again, if I don't want that Z value to be random, I can Control C, Control V, plug this in. If I want to plug more than one thing in, let's say I take this, want to move this over. I can also give this, I can give it multiple numbers. So if I want it to be 12, I can Control C, Control V. I can also give it the number 9. I can hold Shift and plug that in. So now it's giving me 2 numbers that I'm using to input. So holding Shift will let you connect multiple inputs. Holding Control, dragging, will disconnect a component. All right, so I have this series of boxes. I can control their height, width, and length. Let's say I want these I'm kind of tight in this direction. So let's say I want to move their spacing to be farther apart. Well, going back to this move, I'm moving them in the X direction. Step size is 10. I want to change that to, let's say, 20. So I double click, set my max to be 50 of this slider. So now I can set this to 20 comfortably and give them some spacing here. All right, so I'm moving them in the X direction. I could have also chosen to move them in the Z direction. So double click, hit Z. I'm moving now, I'm overriding this, and I'm moving them in the Z direction. Same thing, double click Y, can move them in the Y direction. All right, so this is to create a linear set of points that I'm using to create these boxes. If I disconnect that, again, holding control, now it's just creating one box. What I can do is move this over, and I'm going to middle mouse click, give this the name create box. So again, these are labels that I'm using to remind myself later. So when I come back to this, I'll remember what this chunk of components are doing. All right. And so I have these points that I moved. Again, I don't want to have just a line of points. I want to have a grid of points that I use for these boxes. So if I go under vector, you'll see grid. So with grid, there's different grid types. I can create a hexagonal, radial, rectangular, square, and triangular grid. I'm going to use rectangular. So this will output, if I mouse over this, grid cell outlines. It'll also output points at each corner of that grid. The inputs that it's looking for give me a base plane, so world XY by default. Size of grid cells in the X, Y direction, and the number of grid cells in the X and Y direction. So if I want my size of grid cell to be 12, I can plug that in here, and you'll see that the number in each direction, let's say we want 15 in each direction. And if we want these to be different numbers, Control C, Control V, and we can play with these independently. So I have grid cells now in this direction, grid cells in this direction. All right, so I have grids. All right, so I have this grid. I have points at each corner. I also have grid cell outlines. Which do you think I need to plug in to the box to create a box at every grid cell? It's looking for a point. So it's looking for a base plane, but those base planes all need a point. So I'm going to plug that in. And now what it's doing is it's using each point in my grid as my center for the box, or my origin for the box. And these are all overlapping. So I need to give this a little bit more space. So I'm going to play with the spacing of these. So with my slider, I can increase the spacing between all of these points, and therefore between all of the boxes that it's creating. And again, I can still play with all of these height values, width, and length independently. But I have this grid. Let's say I have too many. I want to reduce the number in either direction. I can do this. Again, bring down my size. And just like before, we can take this series of boxes and we can input our, oops, this wasn't grouped in. So I'm going to select this, right click, say add to group. Now this all moves together. Let's say I want to input my random values into this. Now, if I were to do that, again, looking at a panel, Shift, I can see that I still only have 10 values starting at 0 to 9, right? I have these 10 values. If I were to plug those in, it's going to get confused, right? Because I'm only giving it 10 numbers, but I have 25 boxes. So 5 in this direction, 5 in that direction. So it's getting confused with the data because I'm giving it only 10 in this case, but here I have 25 values. So, here I'm getting 0 to 15, 0 to 15. So it's kind of getting confused as to the sizing of these things, and you'll see some overlap. So what we need to do is create the proper number of points, right? Or the proper number of values. So you'll see that I have 25 points here. We need to find a way to give this a range from 0 to 25, 0 to 25, and so on. So I want to use this, not the values, but the list length. So I want Grasshopper to say, count how many numbers are in this case 25, and use that number 25 to input into all of the upper bounds of these domains, and give this also 25 random seeds, right? Or 25 random numbers. So of course I could just double click and type the number 25 and input that manually, right? I could input 25 into this, but that's not a very elegant solution. As I, change these, the size of all of these, the number of cells, it's gonna get confused because I'll have to update this 25 every time. So that's not very elegant. So I'm gonna delete that. What I wanna do is get an output from this that will change. As I change this, it'll update the number of values and input those into this. So what I'm going to do is called list length. So if I type list length, and you'll find this under sets, list length. So what this does is if I give it a list, it'll tell me how many items are in that list. And I'm going to have to flatten it to give me the number that I want. To flatten it, just right click, hit flatten. I won't go into what that really means at this point. It's just a kind of a data organization thing. But I'm going to flatten this list. So now my output is this number 25. And again, I can show that in a panel to make it clear. It's giving me the number 25. And as I change these values, right, it's going to change the output number as well. So it's parametric. I can double click and just input a number that way. So I have this number 25. I want to use that in my upper boundaries of all of these. So it's going to create all of these boxes that are sized that way. Actually, for these, they don't need that, but even this, I want to use this in my number of random values. So instead of just outputting 10 values, I want this to output 25 values. All right, so from 0 to 24 is 25 values, and I'm going to use all 25 of those here. And so now I have from 0 to all of these, 25 seeds. This is still giving me from 0 to 15. I'm going to see. Okay, so I had to flatten this, the base plane here. So those are getting flattened just to make this data work. But I'm going to update the grid size as well so that these are a little bit more spaced out. But this is an example of using a grid. And again, it's using the points on that grid as the origin for each of these boxes. Each box has a size, 25 by 25 at this location, and a random height. So play with this again, this is really just how to create a grid, use that grid to create a series of boxes. You don't have to use the random height in the script you're working on. This is just an example to show you how, the script works and how we can manipulate and move points to create boxes and 3D volumes. Okay, so you can do this with a surface. You imagine creating a surface, getting the points from that surface and instantiating boxes onto that surface. So as you manipulate the surface, the boxes will change. So there's a lot of different things you can do with these kind of starting components.